Okay, good morning. Yes, this is working. I have to talk into this so it's recorded. Okay. See who's last through Harari. Okay, so we were going very slowly through the first half of the book, then I figured today, well, there it is. Today we'll go through the rest. And I'll just, we're not going to be able to go through in the detail that we did with the other classes. He lays out his basic approach in the beginning, right, with understanding how he's using his basic ideas that information technology is the structure through which societies form, is how they communicate. And that goes back to the first book with Sapiens. So he says that the great advance that Sapiens made was that originally the same thing as groups of apes, you'd be able to make pretty much 50 to 150. You can't really get bigger than that. But then with the development of new forms of technology is how you're able to form cooperation networks with larger and larger groups. And that's the use of language and also transmitting the language through writing. And that's what allows societies to get bigger, and that's the technological advance that sapiens have over other species of apes, which is our family, So that's the basic idea. And then he talks about how specifically in totalitarian regimes and democracies, and he compares that in the second half of the book and how they use communication networks in different ways, and then the liabilities and the dangers, and and how we can it's obvious what the dangers are of totalitarianism. Doesn't have to spell that out. He shows though how totalitarian regimes use communication technology to communicate their versions of truth and to get everyone on the same page. It's more interesting, his analysis of democracy, because it starts to paint a very bleak picture, but then he gives his suggestions for how democracies can function and survive with the revolution of AI, which what he's talking about at the end, and he sort of spelled out the dangers there, but he said basically the way to move forward is to have, it's his thing he keeps coming back to, he calls it self-correcting mechanisms, right, where you have, you're able to keep, and he goes through in more detail, but that's his basic idea, that you just have to keep things in check and not give over the control. Well, bureaucracy is right, and how to control, or have a self-correcting mechanism for the bureaucracy. Exactly. So, so we were up to chapter 6 here, on page 193, which he calls "How Computers Are Different from the Printing Presses." And that's an important question, because you think, well, it's just the next, first you have the invention of writing, and then you have the invention of the printing press, so you don't have to individually write everything out. And then this is sort of the next revolution, because through the internet and through it's even faster than the printing press. Information is spread instantly. And that's, although of course, in a sense, some of the things are not as dramatic as he talks about, because it's really the invention of the telegram and radio. They were already, right, we've been living with those for 100 years, and that was a way of spreading information instantaneously. So it's not like we had to wait for the internet before information can be sent immediately. You send things electronically when you used to send a fax or a telegram, but you can still send it right away. So it. You can't send it from your phone. You have to go to an office, right? You have to go to an office. And the thousands to reach thousands of people, right? That's exactly. Where even if something were faxed or telegram, you're still dependent on it then being printed in a newspaper and then being on the corner for people to purchase to get the information. Or it could be announced on the radio and then people hear the radio. But now it goes into everyone's phone immediately. You're right. Yeah. So he has an interesting passage on page 201. He talks about the difference between intelligence and consciousness, right, where he's saying that the question is whether an AI can attain consciousness. He says, this is his definition. He says, intelligence is the ability to attain goals such as maximizing user engagement on a social media platform. Consciousness is the ability to experience subjective feelings like pain, pleasure, love, and hate. So there's consciousness is sort of an emotional relation with something, which is where intelligence is just figuring out what's the best approach to something. So consciousness is a higher level. But he's not saying that an AI can't have consciousness. We're in a sense, our emotions are programmed, the way our intelligences work also. But that's the distinction that he's making there. And then another thing that he says, and what's different between the AI versus the printing press, is that in the past, whatever the spread is of the information, there always needed to be a human involved, right? So if something was sent, so I had information, and then I sent the telegram, and then a human needs to read the telegram, and then write the newspaper article, and then that's sent out, or make the radio announcement. Whereas now, you can have computer-to-computer chains without a human in it. Right, where the computer sends the information and another computer then presents it and spreads it out, and that's a difference, right? And that's why he argues that we need more the self-correcting mechanisms. And then he talks, of course, how how the information is manipulated by the algorithms and this goes to what I was talking about on Rosh Hashanah, right, where the information feed that people get on their phones is the algorithm targets it for what the person wants to know or what they're looking for. So it's not refereed by a human editor the way that a newspaper editor would referee something. And it's not self-correcting, exactly. Now, and there are people that are judicious that will, when they get something, they'll then check it and look at a source of a trusted newspaper to see how it's reported. So but other people will just take what they get on their feed. So yeah, Stacey. Yeah. Or bodies without consciousness, right? Or at least bodies without intelligence, right? Yeah, no, and that's what he talks about. He talks about that in his other books too. That in a sense, well, right, but also bodies, but we make fewer and fewer decisions, right? We see decision making is made for us by these artificial intelligences. It decides where we want to go for dinner, what show we want to watch on TV, what we need to do for our health. Like everything we're just following what the artificial intelligence tells us to do. So we're employing critical thought to far lesser degree than we used to. Yeah, you could. It's already very dated, but his book Homo Deus, he really follows that rabbit, and talks about how eventually it will change the way our bodies function because you'll have implants that will be controlled by the algorithm that will, the same way in the sense like, we have that already with heart monitors, but there's more and more advances that can be done where we'll already be different. We won't be fully biological anymore, and the use of the technology and how that can interface with our bodies is something. It's no longer science fiction, and that's where he talks. Yeah, whatever you're saying in that.
That we rely persistent example is that we rely on AI for getting from one place to another. And if you talk to a
Right.
young person who has never read a map and
Yeah.
they are not able to picture the roads.
Yeah.
I know this road goes east-west.
Right.
I know that one. So if I go east-west on this road, I can go north-south on that.
Right,
road.
and people there was a story of There's a story from a few years ago of a American couple that rented a car in Greece, and they were driving, and it got the town wrong, and they ended up driving 9 hours to the other side of Greece before they realized that they went the wrong way, you know. And then on a lower scale, I mean, I was on Route 4 on Friday, and I had to go to ShopRite to buy a few things, and had to be someplace else at a certain time, so I figured I'd go to the ShopRite and the one on Maple Avenue in Fairlawn. And then I decided, but I said, you know what, maybe I should go to Rochelle Park. And I didn't remember how to, sometimes the U-turn's a little confusing. So I just plugged it in and I said, ShopRite, Rochelle Park. And then my thing is recomputing. And basically it took me on the big loop U-turn off of Route 4, all the way around here, around the circle, and then back on Route 4 going still the same direction to the ShopRite in Fairlawn. Like, it didn't change it to Rochelle Park. And I didn't even realize until after U-turning for 10 minutes in traffic, I realized I've accomplished nothing. I'm still doing the same thing. So I'm like, shame on me for not thinking about what I was doing. Well, we are seeing, and then he talks about how that affects democracy, right? Where if we're not able to have conversations with each other, the kind that when we did the Hannah Arendt, year, right? Her point, the basis of democracy, democratic systems, is people engaging with each other and debating ideas. And, so his argument is that this is endangering the end of that type of society where everyone is siloed into only really receiving information from their side, and there's no conversation with the other side of the aisle, and then that's a danger. Right. So that's the danger for society, because when you don't have a conversation and society is so polarized as it is now, and this was what we talked about last time, right? So it can still be a democracy, but a democracy means 51% gets to tyrannize the other 49% because there's no real discussion and give and take. So things can flip, and maybe that is what's left of the self-correcting mechanism, is how, people, if they start to wake up, like, we've even seen some right-wing conspiracy talk show people saying, oh, maybe I made a mistake. Well, that is a self-correcting mechanism, right? And then there's still, and then we'll see how, but it's slow, and it doesn't always happen. So anyway, so let's look at a few more passages. So we're on page 219 in the section Taking Responsibility. It says, the main message of the previous chapters has been that information isn't truth, and that information revolutions don't uncover the truth. They create new political structures, economic models, and cultural norms. Since the current information revolution is more momentous than any previous information revolution, it is likely to create unprecedented realities on an unprecedented scale. Right? So it was the thesis that he made at the very beginning of the book, that this idea that the more information we make available to people have the right information, then they'll make more intelligent decisions. And he's arguing that that's not the case, right? That it's actually the opposite, that you have more information, that people will a human brain can't possibly process all the information there is. So and when it's fed to us in that very siloed, way that's just geared towards one view, then that that actually limits our understanding rather than increases our understanding, Yeah. Yeah, it's not even, right. I think it's not even the people. So he says that the way that the algorithm works is that the more it wants to produce outrage, because the more it wants people to be angry, because that will get more, right? So, and that was his talk about the Rohingya massacre, right? It was a one-sided view that got people angry at the other, at the other, because that's the only thing that was being spread. Because that's more. Whereas voice of moderation is not exciting. I mean, in a sense, it's true in the printed news also. I mean, boring news doesn't sell. You know, the tabloids always do better than the New York Times and the Washington Post, but it's all the more so extreme, right, when the news is all being fed through an algorithm. So it's the artificial intelligence that's making the decision, but then it goes back to how it is programmed, right? If the program is get as many people clicking as possible, then it will spread the information of the click. So that's where how do we correct that, right? And how do we control that? And that's where he's, you know, as one of the public intellectuals, you know, in terms of getting governments to think about how to use the technology in more responsible ways. That's what his point is, right? That you can't just to allow the algorithm to just give people whatever they want, because then it increases the problems that we have on a greater scale, right? A large scale in terms of conflicts, and also just on an individual scale. It brings people that get angry or upset, and then it affects mental health. There was a story just last week that ChatGPT was being charged for wrongful death because it had given us information that led to death by suicide, I think. And but how do you? But again, you can't imprison an artificial intelligence. So the solution is, right, is how do you make changes in the way it works? Yeah.
Back in 1959, what I learned in college is something very poor algorithms are all over the place. Is that people tend to read those things that just reinforce what they already
Yeah.
believe.
Right.
Information bias. So
You read what you want to. Yeah.
it's a problem not only because of an algorithm, it's human.
It's always been the case. It's just that this makes it more extreme, right? It makes it that much worse. But it's always been the case, right? Every newspaper has its take on things, and what you choose to read, what station you choose to watch.
But again, newspapers used to have power. Now they don't have as much power because exactly. I was going to say, because people are turning off to it. AI is going to figure out how to get all the money. It's going to beat the stock market, and then therefore it's going to have all the power. And the story? No, people turn off to information altogether. When they
Yeah.
realize that they're being fed everything information bias, then they say, you know what, I don't want to know anything.
Right.
And I think the answer is us. I mean, it kept
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. The answer is what do we? So he says this, right, and he says this on page. Yeah.
Well, the young people that I see in college, they are buying into it 100%.
I don't know, 100%, but yeah.
Exactly.
So he says, so on page 237, he says, my goal here is to balance, you know, utopian visions by focusing on the more sinister potential of algorithmic pattern recognition. Hopefully we can harness the positive potential of algorithms while regulating their destructive capacities. So it's up to us. You know, this says up to us to harness it and know how to control it. Right, and understand how it works, exactly.
You're not really sure
Right,
what is real and fair.
exactly.
As opposed to what's
Right.
being fed to you.
Right, I mean, I do that when what show am I going to watch, and I go on Netflix or whatever the other streamer is, and it's giving me a menu, but it's giving me a menu based upon my previous selections. So if I want to try something new, then you have to scroll further. You have to work a little harder. Not as hard as we used to work. We used to have to actually go to Blockbuster. But yeah, but that's right. You see, you went to Blockbuster where it's given for everyone, right? Or given towards the audience of the people that live in a certain neighborhood, as opposed to in the menu on your streamer, it's just based on your buying preferences. So you have to understand that. And then you can look beyond it. Okay, so this is where I was talking about outrage. He says that on 259, he says, outrage drives engagement up while moderation tends not to. So, and that's what we need to understand, right? Because that's a problem with the way that this new information system works. But then he says, he has this section heading starting on 261 when he writes, blame the humans. And here it says to the bottom of 263, 264, as we have seen again and again throughout history, in a completely free information fight, truth tends to lose. To tilt the balance in favor of truth, networks must develop and maintain strong, self-correcting mechanisms that reward truth-telling. These self-correcting mechanisms are costly, but if you want to get the truth, you must invest in them. As opposed to information, right?
People have different perceptions of what they think is true. And they're right, because there are different realities.
Yeah, right. So, right, and I think that then that goes back to, I would say it goes back to Hannah Arendt, that this truth is negotiated. But you negotiate, the only way to figure out is to negotiate it by being in conversation. So it's what in academia is called the peer review process, you know, and
We're in a fabulous time now of revised fact. Look at the whole thing about, blacks and Indians and everything, how Trump is trying to erase
right,
the whole,
and it's right, and the
this isn't a fact.
right, and it's caused a lot of pressure on the whole American historical establishment, right? With how do we approach the 250th birthday of the country? How do we tell the story of what happened 250 years ago, right? Because the government wants one perspective, and there are very different other perspectives as well, you know. And how do we tell that? And what story do we tell? You know, and that's yeah. Right, but that's okay. Look, we've always understood, right, through our education that it's never black and white. You know, that there is in history a story, right? And I mean, my professors when I was in graduate school would always say, whatever book by whatever historian we were reading, my professor would always say, what story is he trying to tell or she trying to tell? Right? Well, and that's the way to think. But the story is still based on marshaling of evidence, you know, and that's where that's the self-correcting part, you know, and that's why you have to look at the footnotes and then you look at the other and you read something else of someone who disagrees with that person, and that's the discussion, you know. So that how do we weigh the evidence? It's done in historiography, it's done in science, it's done in politics, but then you need that exchange of different views, and that's what I think is critical. He has this part where he quotes from this. He describes this book called Superintelligence, Nick Bostrom, about the paperclip and Napoleon. Did you get that part? He says it's a danger of illustrated the danger using a thought experiment which is reminiscent of Goethe's Sorcerer's Apprentice. Bostrom asks us to imagine that a paperclip factory buys a superintelligent computer, and that the factory's human manager gives the computer a seemingly simple task. This is on page 272. Produce as many paperclips as possible. In pursuit of this goal, the paperclip computer conquers the whole planet Earth, kills all the humans, sends expeditions to take over additional planets, and uses the enormous resources it acquires to fill the entire galaxy with paperclip factories. So, right, and that's it's a thought experiment, but that's what he said. It's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. So it's that you have to, you can't just because the computer doesn't have, you need that you need the corrective. You know, you always need a corrective in terms of, right. Yeah. So let me see what else here I lined here. So let me jump to page 285. He talks about, so how did bureaucratic systems throughout history set their ultimate goal? So he says they relied on mythology to inform. Mythology is how you tell the story, so you define what you want to do. They cannot believe in any mythology because they are non-conscious entities, bureaucracies, so they don't actually believe in things as long as, so however, once However, one of the most important things to realize about computers that don't have beliefs, they just have programming, is that when a lot of computers communicate with one another, they can create intercomputer realities, analogous to the intersubjective realities produced by networks of humans. These intercomputer realities may eventually become as powerful and as dangerous as human-made intersubjective myths. And then that's, he talks about how you understand society, and he talks about the dangers there when you have use a artificial intelligence to help with, there have been studies about this, to help with job searches. So it can, save a lot of time from HR resources to kind of sift through when you have hundreds of or thousands of resumes for a position. The problem is the artificial intelligence will also have biases that it takes until you, just like humans have biases in terms of what they're looking for, and then so you have to find a way to correct that. Yeah.
When you were talking about the mythology and the lack thereof in AI, it occurred to me, and I haven't flushed my thought out yet because it just occurred to me, is that what is also lacking is a fundamental understanding that AI does not have of the hero's journey. Because if you look at the roadmap or the mapping of all those Greek mythology stories and all the stories we tell about the human condition, Star Wars and Wizard of Oz and all of those, you have an ordinary person who does something extraordinary, has the horrible things they go through, comes out better at the end with an ability to teach others. That's the hero's journey.
Right.
And AI is lacking that journey, that human journey. It just goes foraging ahead, combining with other AI to forage ahead without that understanding of this life being a journey. And that, I think, is something that just occurs to me.
Yeah, and when he makes a distinction, right, between just a program and an AI, what makes it an artificial intelligence is that it continues learning beyond what its programmer programmed it, right? And that's the difference. But is it learning, how does it understand the learning process, right? And that's the thing. Not all humans understand that either.
An experience for a journey, for a
Right,
hero's journey.
right. Although not all humans are capable of the perspective of understanding that the journey evolves. And,
But they live it. Whether they don't
Yeah.
understand it or not, everyone has
Yeah.
lived the hero's journey.
yeah, they,
I was just going to say that a lot of how humans become compassionate is by reading fictional tales.
Right.
The fiction.
and that's why the humanities are an important part of education. So many people don't appreciate. That's why they take English classes. It's not just to learn grammar, right? Yes.
The other part about artificial intelligence is that truths or whatever are not weighted. So what our intelligence does
Mhm.
is give more weight to certain things than other things, which helps us make decisions.
Right.
But when you have everything out there flat, how do you, is the algorithm determining what,
Right.
how do they figure out
Yeah.
what is more important?
Right.
And that's where the bias
Right, and that's where, so then and here I want to focus on this a little slower. It starts in 298, because he talks about religion again, and as I've always said, I think he misunderstands religion because he has a very simplistic understanding of it. But he says that's, here, I'll read this section here. He says, the humans who currently engineer computers need to accept that they are not manufacturing new tools. They are unleashing new kinds of independent agents, potentially even new kinds of gods. And when you trust a god as infallible, now people are trusting the computers, the artificial intelligences as infallible, which is the opposite of what he's saying, because he's saying you need a corrective mechanism. What he misunderstands religion is that religions have self-correcting mechanisms also, otherwise they wouldn't have lasted this long, and that's what he doesn't. So I'll show you how. So he has this section called The New Gods, and he says, we saw in chapter 4, already thousands of years ago, humans dreamed about finding an infallible information technology to shield us from human corruption and error. Holy books were an audacious attempt to craft such a technology, but they backfired. And I wrote in my margin, again, he doesn't understand religious myth and how scripture works. That they are, but that's how, he says, since the book couldn't interpret itself, a human institution had to be built to interpret the sacred words, adapt them to different circumstances. And then he says later, algorithms are independent agents, but they are already taking power away from us. That's what we talked about power. See, if they cause disaster, simply changing our beliefs about them will not necessarily stop them. It is highly likely that if computers are entrusted with power, they will cause disasters, for they are fallible. But what I wrote in my margin also is that the ancients understood that gods were fallible also. I mean, certainly the ancient Greeks understood that. They were very fallible, and they were right. And even in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, God gets emotional, and God has emotional needs and expresses disappointment and sadness and anger, and love. And that's how, in a sense, that's what when we say we're in the image of God, although my friend Benjamin Summers, a Bible professor at the seminary, he argues that the ancients actually believed that God did have a body, but that's a very complicated thing. But I think later it's understood that we're in the image of God in terms of our ability, our emotions. We say, and then the Talmud, when it talks about what does it mean to walk in God's paths, it means to practice compassion with other people. So, but that's fallibility there too. So we always understood that there was and then in the terms of law, like he writes, this is I'm on page 300 now, large-scale societies cannot exist without some mythology, but that doesn't mean all mythologies are equal. To guard against errors and excesses, some mythologies have acknowledged their own fallible origin and included a self-correcting mechanism allowing humans to question and change the mythology. That's the model of the US Constitution, for example, but how can humans probe and correct computer mythology? We don't understand. So my argument with him is all legal systems function that way. That historians of law will say every legal system has a way to amend it and a way to adopt to take account of new circumstances. It's not unique to American constitutional law. So he writes, as the end of the 301, he says, ancient Jews and Christians were disappointed to discover that the Bible couldn't interpret itself and reluctantly maintained human institutions to do what the technology couldn't. So I wrote, what do you mean disappointed? Maybe they were joyful. They could have celebrated that the Bible couldn't interpret itself. They were happy to continue that process of writing, the process of constructive meaning, So so my point is that not that I'm just picking not being pedantic that he misunderstands religion. I think for me it tempers his alarm. Yes, we do have to be aware of how AI and artificial intelligence and algorithms work, and we have to put and it is incumbent on society and ultimately governments to regulate it, but it's a different scale, but in a sense it's not something new, and that this is the way we've always worked with things, and we've never been like, it's not like we were duped that we used to follow things that were infallible and now infallible. I think ultimately, or at least more intelligent people understand that, that we structure our meanings through stories, right? And we understand that things aren't perfect, and we're always refining things and trying to make them better. So that.
You're saying you don't feel as alarmed because you see this as a difference, but in some way a continuation of things that have happened.
Yes, I think we've always responded to different types of challenges, and that human society is very adaptive, and I think more adaptive than he gives it credit. And I hope so too. doesn't every generation try to program that into the next generation? Right?
It's gonna end up only a strata of society is gonna have access and benefit of AI. And the rest is gonna go within.
No, being manipulated, the manipulation is based on
It's pervasive. I mean, even in the poorest of countries, everyone has cell phones. It's amazing how you know.
Just made a great point that, the AI is not just programming, which a cell phone is just,
Yeah.
maybe it was another article, but even on in here, I thought about who's gonna get the power, because AI's gonna figure out, well, we're gonna lose our jobs, and AI's gonna have all the money, and I think he suggested in the book that governments just have to regulate.
Yes, he said
But,
that.
and then I start thinking about how the person has corporations,
It's very difficult because this is such a global society, and what you can control and what you can't control, and who governs what. So this is, a huge problem. It's not something that is even easily defined.
Yeah, yeah. So he tries to focus it on politics at the end. So the last section of the book he calls computer politics. And he starts with a great sentence beginning at chapter 9. He says, civilizations are born from the marriage of bureaucracy and mythology. Which I thought was a great, it's a beautiful line there. Then he writes, on 306, novel technology often leads to historical disasters, not because the technology is inherently bad, but because it takes time for humans to learn how to use it wisely. And, we're still haunted by the technology of nuclear weapons and nuclear power. I was reading today is the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. And there was a whole page in this morning's New York Times that was talking about that and saying how although it didn't breach it, one Russian drone in 2020, last year, that it was cost $50,000 will cost $500 million to repair the damage of that $50,000 drone because it didn't breach it, but it has to be repaired in the hull that covers the most radioactive section. And this huge area that's the restricted zone, that's the size of the state of like Rhode Island, that humans will never be able to live in. And, but they use it for military training, so there you go. But that's, of course, what was driving the Iran war also. I was watching is this fear of nuclear weapons and that technology, and that haunts us, and that's the sense of we can't keep up with the technology and the dangers of the technology. So on 309, he talks about democracy. He says, the great advantage of liberal democracy is that it possesses strong self-correcting mechanisms, which limit the excesses of fanaticism and preserve the ability to recognize our errors and try different courses of action. So that's how democracy is supposed to work, right? That there's always ways, and they're written in these forms of correction. And he goes through his, he gives what he thinks are the principles that liberal democracy has to enshrine, and it says it's benevolence, decentralization, and mutuality. And the decentralization is an interesting argument because he says, that often strongman leaders say, that the power needs to be centralized, and that was always when democracies shift to totalitarianism. The argument is that in order to be effective, it has to be the power of the state needs to be totalized. And his argument is that when power is decentralized, that's what secures the self-correcting. That's the self-correcting mechanisms. Yeah, it's the argument, right? I mean, people argue all the time that it's sorry, shut my phone off. People argue all the time that our system is so decentralized. I mean, this morning, we have our guest cantor, the Shabbat, Abramowitz. I woke up this morning. I've been up since 4:15. I woke up to pick him up from the airport because he had a direct flight from Tel Aviv. And And then he's going to be staying here about a week, and I had to explain that this, unlike Europe, this is a third world country here. You need to have New Jersey Transit, but then you need a whole different system when you get to Manhattan. And in Europe, it's just one thing. It doesn't. Everything works together. So, but in a sense, that division, right? Different states and the federal, it does sort of, we have this boundary, right? So it would be much harder, and I think to the frustration of the president, it's hard to instill a will throughout everywhere in the country because power is so divided, in so different sections, and while it makes it clumsy, it also protects, in a sense, against it protects the life of the democracy. Yeah, and the individual, right? Absolutely. So. And he talks about the pace of democracy, and starting on 316, he talks about how Hitler came to power within a democracy, and then was able, quickly assume power. But it's even there, he says in 1928, the Nazi Party won less than 3% of the vote. The Weimar Republic seemed to be prospering. Within less than 5 years, the Weimar Republic had collapsed, and Hitler was the absolute dictator of Germany. It's not exactly true, in that he didn't become the full dictator till Hindenburg died, which was 1934. So it's 8 years, not 6 years, 5 years, but it still happened, and that's always that's the warning, right? And that's whenever I teach, modern Jewish German history, you have to understand that one of the important lessons is that the Nazis came to power in a liberal democracy. And that should always be a warning sign, that in order for the self-correcting mechanisms don't exist on their own. They need the commitment of those that are entrusted with them, and that's something that is certainly understood, and something that a period that we're living through in this country, right, where you can have all the checks and balances written in the Constitution, but if Congress does decide not to exercise its oversight, and the court doesn't flex its muscles, then it's not, it doesn't matter what's in the Constitution, and that's in a sense, so that's always the danger, and that's where it's important. That's why teaching civics is important as well as humanities, and understanding the role of how you keep this. He writes about, and he has a section about, will ChatGPT take over things, and then what about, which kind of jobs are we giving up to technology? So on page 321, because this was very personal for me. So what about priests? How would Orthodox Jews or Christians feel about a robot officiate their wedding ceremony, letting a robot officiate their wedding ceremony? So first of all, I said, why does he preface qualified Jews with Orthodox? Because he's a secular Israeli, so he would be more than happy to not have a rabbi at his wedding. Also, he's married to a man, and in Israel, the religion is, personal status is governed by religion. It's the old Ottoman Empire system. So there is no rabbi who would officiate at the marriage between him and his husband. So we had to have a civil marriage anyway, and Israel doesn't have civil marriage, so we had to have it somewhere else. So he's already kind of separated from, because that system is more frozen than the system that we have. But then he says, even professions that are the preserve of conscious entities, like priests, might eventually be taken over by computers, because computers could one day gain the ability to feel pain and love. Even if they can't, humans may nevertheless come to treat them as if they can, for the connection between consciousness and relationships goes both ways. And this goes to, all the stories we've been reading about people develop relationships with their AIs, and friendships and all that stuff. So then, but I wrote in my margin, I said, isn't that how we relate to God? Right? Right? Don't we have conversations with God, relate to God as if God is, speaking back to us, when there's no, it's an idea, right? And actually, God may not be as responsive as an AI, actually. So, but maybe that's a good thing, right? Right. But even the thing about the confessional, right? It doesn't matter what the priest hears or says. It matters what the confessor understands, and that's the confessing, the one who is confessing. Okay, so he talks about what he calls the conservative suicide in the 2010s and 2020s. This is page 324. Conservative parties in numerous democracies have been hijacked by unconservative leaders such as Donald Trump and have been transformed into radical revolutionary parties. So he's saying that what we used to call conservative means you don't want to change things, but actually when you have leaders like Donald Trump, there's a lot of change going on. And then he writes the end of that paragraph, it writes, on January 6, 2021, many Trump supporters observed the storming of the US Capitol with enthusiasm. Trump supporters may explain that existing institutions are so dysfunctional that there is just no alternative to destroying them and building entirely new structures from scratch. And that's revolution. It's the opposite of conservatism, right? But irrespective of whether this view is right or wrong, this is a quintessential revolutionary rather than conservative view. Okay, he agrees with my analysis. The conservative suicide has taken progressives utterly by surprise and has forced progressive parties like the US Democratic Party to become the guardians of the old order and of established institutions, right? So the Democrats have sort of become the conservative party, but it's always been true. And it's also always been the case, it's not a new thing, that the Democrats have always been the party of government, right? They since Woodrow Wilson, who really, in the Wilson administration, really formed sort of the platform of the current Democratic Party. The Democrats are the new Federalists, and they all of the things that a federal bureaucracy can do to mold society, right, is all sort of the platform of the Democratic Party. So the party has been basically supportive of government. That's why the Republicans love to get elected on platforms of lowering taxes. For Democrats, it's more complicated because Democrats need taxes because they need to fund a government that they believe in, a government that does positive things. So in a sense, it's not like, so my point is, again, and I say this to mitigate, that it's not a new thing. In a sense, the left-wing party has really been the conservative party for 100 years anyway. So in the sense of conservative, in that you support government, which is ultimately what conservatives were supposed to be. But these things are, like you said, Lee, like they always go in a circle, and that's, so my point is it should be, rather than be alarming, I think that should be consoling, and that maybe the distances are not really so far. And that's where people can learn when they're having conversations to speak language that the other side can understand, Yeah.
Part of the problem is that because everything is sanitized as it goes, I take comfort in knowing that the craziness in this country has happened before. But it's hard to ferret out the facts about when it happened before, because everything is sanitized so that you don't get all the bubbles and all the terrible things that have happened in this country for years. You don't see them, and people don't know about them.
Heather Cox Richardson. Subscribe to Heather Cox Richardson.
Okay.
She's really so interesting.
Yeah, all right, so let me read a bit more here. He talks about, on page 324, he says one of what makes this challenging is that it's so hard for us to understand the way that the new information technology works. He writes, the increasing unfathomability of our information network is one of the reasons for the recent wave of populist parties and charismatic leaders. When people can no longer make sense of the world, and when they feel overwhelmed by immense amounts of information they cannot digest, they become easy prey for conspiracy theories, and they turn for salvation to something they do not understand, a human. But again, I would say that in a sense, human societies have always worked that way, right? Because just life is unfathomable, right? So when you have a leader, a teacher, a charismatic who seems wise, who gives a direction and people tend to follow that person, and that's so it's not, so again, the degree is greater because it's so, the more complex things get, the harder it is to understand. The more you want the simple solution. He says, the problem is that algorithms make decisions by relying on numerous data, whereas humans find it very difficult to consciously reflect on a large number of data points and weigh them against each other. We prefer to work with single data points. That's why, when faced by complex issues, whether a loan request, a pandemic, or a war, we often seek a single reason to take a particular course of action and ignore all other considerations. This is the fallacy of the single cause, he calls it. You know, that we want simple explanations when things in the world often have multiple causes. You know, it was like that when I was in graduate school in history, you know, where it used to be you would just learn, like, why did World War I happen? Why would World War II happen? Well, there's a one-line answer, you know, because this. Whereas when you learn it deeper, there's multiple causes, you know, and it's because of the combination of these independent reasons that come together that causes something to happen.
That's World War I. That was
Yeah, right. It's not just because the Archduke was assassinated.
the evaluation of the war.
Yeah, right. Okay, so he says on page 337, while human decisions may seem to rely on just those few data points we are conscious of, in fact, our decisions are subconsciously influenced by thousands of additional data points. Being unaware of these subconscious processes, when we deliberate on our decisions or explain them, we often engage in post hoc, single-point rationalizations for what really happens as billions of neurons interact inside our brain. No, but that's fantastic, right? Because it means that we don't understand how the computers work. Our brains are, thankfully, even more complex, right? And and we don't. And it is comforting in a sense, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's about how much we actually understand our brains. There's a lot of people who are making decisions. A lot of people who aren't looking at evidence.
Yes, exactly.
And causing us brain distraction.
Right.
And they change their minds. Oh, I guess I was wrong about that.
Yeah. Or not even saying I was wrong, just saying I never actually said that.
And what you just,
Yeah.
and what you just read was a good example in the book about how the algorithm is going to choose what interest rate
Mhm.
you're going to be charged. And one of the data points on that was people who let their phones go below 50% charging are less likely to pay their bills on time. And that's just one data point,
Right.
and it's not true for everyone, but it's going to figure that in. And we were just talking about the brain can do better
Yeah.
than saying, all right, maybe they lost their phone.
Right.
It might give equal weight to all of those things,
Yeah.
like that one statistic about the
Yeah.
phone being going below 50%.
Yeah.
It's not true, because it doesn't understand human nature.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So as he's wrapping up the chapter on democracy, as he says, 340, to function, a democracy needs to meet two conditions. It needs to enable a free public conversation on key issues, and it needs to maintain a minimum of social order and institutional trust. Free conversation must not slip into anarchy. Before the advent of newspapers, radios, and other modern information technology, no large-scale society was able to manage, and it's again, it's the same idea, that it's the advent of a technology that allows societies to exist on a larger, at a larger level that we couldn't individually. So he talks about the future democracy. He says, for most of history, large-scale democracy was impossible because information technology wasn't sophisticated enough to hold a large-scale political conversation. Millions of people spread over tens of thousands of square kilometers didn't have the tools to conduct a real-time discussion of public affairs. So now, ironically, democracy may prove impossible because information technology is becoming too sophisticated. So it's the opposite problem, right? And when citizens cannot talk with one another, and when they view each other as enemies rather than political rivals, democracy is untenable, right? So that is the biggest danger, and that's that ultra-polarization where it sees the other side as an enemy. President Obama one of his phrases that I like, that he used to say all the time, he would say, we're all on the same team. And that's critical to understand, and that's sort of the danger. All right, his account of totalitarianism is shorter, and he just kind of summarizes his view here. We jump to page 358. He says, whereas democracies assume that everyone is fallible, in totalitarian regimes, the fundamental assumption is that the ruling party or the supreme leader is always right. Regimes based on that assumption are conditioned to believe in the existence of an infallible intelligence and are reluctant to create strong self-correcting mechanisms that might monitor and regulate the genius at the top. And then I wrote in the margin, in our society are reluctant to utilize such mechanisms, and that's the danger that we're seeing. So let's see. Let me just get to the end where he summarizes things. Okay. Right, so let's see. So 398, one lesson is that the invention of new information technology is always a catalyst for major historical changes, because the most important information is to weave new networks rather than represent pre-existing realities. Right? So we're connecting, in new ways is what's critical. And the invention of AI is potentially more momentous than the invention of the telegraph, the printing press, or even writing, because AI is the first technology that is capable of making decisions and generating ideas by itself. And that was the point that he was making, that you can have computer to computer to computer chain without, where you used to need to have a human between every other connection. And that's so his argument is this is fundamentally different than the previous revolutions, which is what we need to be aware of that danger. He says, studying history does more than just emphasize the importance of the AI revolution and of our decisions regarding AI. This is on page 400. It also cautions us against two common but misleading approaches to information networks and information revolutions. On the one hand, we should be aware of an overly naive and optimistic view. Information isn't truth. That was the point he made at the beginning of the book, right? But its main task is to connect rather than represent, which is why he's called Nexus, right? It's all about the connections. And information networks throughout history have often privileged order over truth. So, okay. And then this book has argued that the fault in 402 isn't with our nature, but with our information networks. Due to the privileging of order over truth, human information networks have often produced a lot of power but little wisdom, right? So, of course, power is not in itself bad if it's used wisely, but it can also be used in very unwise ways. So accordingly, as a network becomes more powerful, its self-correcting mechanisms become more vital. Just as the law of the jungle is a myth, so also is the idea that the arc of history bends towards justice. History is a radically open arc, one that can bend in many directions and reach a very different destination. So this is how he's wrapping up the book here. Even if Homo sapiens destroys itself, the universe will keep going about its business as usual. It took 4 billion years for terrestrial evolution to produce a civilization of highly intelligent apes. If we are gone and it takes evolution another 100 million years to produce a civilization of highly intelligent rats, it will. The universe is patient. And that's very humbling, right? Yeah, I'm not sure if that's consoling or not, but it's very humbling. Yeah, but then here, I'll read you the end of the book here. So there is, though, an even worse scenario. As far as we know today, apes, rats, and other organic animals of planet Earth may be the only conscious entities in the entire universe. We have now created a non-conscious but very powerful alien intelligence. If we mishandle it, AI might extinguish not only the human dominion on Earth, but the light of consciousness itself, turning the universe into a realm of utter darkness. It is our responsibility to prevent this. The good news, besides the fact that it's statistically just impossible that there's not other places that are maybe doing even better than we are somewhere elsewhere in the universe. The good news is that if we eschew complacency and despair, we are capable of creating balanced information networks that will keep their own power in check. Doing so is not a matter of inventing another miracle technology or landing upon some brilliant idea that has somehow escaped all previous generations. Rather, to create wiser networks, we must abandon both the naive and the populist views of information, put aside our fantasies of infallibility, and commit ourselves to the hard and rather mundane work of building institutions with strong self-correcting mechanisms. That is perhaps the most important takeaway this book has to offer. And then that was his conclusion. The final paragraph is, this wisdom is much older than human history. It is elemental, the foundation of organic life. The first organisms weren't created by some infallible genius or God. They emerged through an intricate process of trial and error. Over 4 billion years, ever more complex mechanisms of mutation and self-correction led to the evolution of trees, dinosaurs, jungles, and eventually humans. Now we have summoned an alien, inorganic intelligence that could escape our control and put in danger not just our own species, but countless other life forms. The decisions we all make in the coming years will determine whether summoning this alien intelligence proves to be a terminal error or the beginning of a hopeful new chapter in the evolution of life. And that goes what you said. It's all really up to us in the end. So that's the book. We got through a lot. Thank you all.